Get into it. First question is just like, what got you into racing? Like, how did you start out?
Well, I started out when I was 9 years old. I got a go-kart for my ninth birthday, and my passion for racing was already pretty prevalent. My dad was a big race fan, and so we always watched Formula One races together and IndyCar races together, and used to go to the race in Toronto all the time as a kid. And I was always a big fan of the sport, and yeah, I got a go-kart for my ninth birthday, and just kind of started it just as a hobby, to be honest.
Yeah, just like a side note, I actually went to a Honda Indy and watched you race, I think 3 years ago or something like that.
Right
So
on.
yeah, it's really cool that. Yeah, so I just kind of want to segue into the street racing thing, but like, could you discuss like some of the dangers of like IndyCar racing? Like what goes on behind the scenes and like what's so dangerous about that whole aspect of professional racing?
Right. So, professional racing obviously carries with it a certain risk level that, isn't necessarily there in a lot of other sports. And it's something that drivers have to accept and understand. But it comes from one very simple factor, and that's speed. The sort of golden saying, the joking saying is going fast never hurt anybody. It was stopping suddenly that does the damage. And that is ultimately what's so dangerous about motorsports is the speeds we are going. When something goes wrong and you hit a wall or an object or something, at a high rate of speed, the risk to the driver is monumental. And we're doing it at the absolute limit of the race car. We're on the edge of grip. We are
Mhm.
inches away from other competitors, from the wall, from whatever it might be. And so you're putting yourself at the edge of grip in a very fast and dangerous situation.
Yeah, of course. So just like in comparison, what are some of the risks like people don't normally think about when street racing?
I think what a lot of people fail to understand when street racing or driving fast in any scenario is if you haven't grown up doing it, if you haven't been through the experience of a professional driver, you don't realize how quickly things can change. At a certain speed, everything is happening so fast, and all it takes is, I mean, not even something distracting you. It could be something that's sitting on the road you didn't know about. It could be reacting to the behavior of another car on the road that could be erratic and unpredictable. It could be a change in surface. It could be a change in weather. At a certain speed, a big gust of
Mhm.
wind or a sudden downpour of rain can have a disastrous effect on what a car does. And so when you're doing that in an environment that's not a controlled environment, a specific circuit built to keep cars safe and pointed in one direction, and
Mhm.
all those sort of things, the risks just go up exponentially. What I do as a professional is an incredibly risky job. I talk to professional hockey players, baseball players, football players, whatever, and they all tell me I'm crazy. They would never do what I do. Well, I
Yeah.
think of people that try to do what I do in an uncontrolled environment on the road, and I think they're absolutely out of their
Of
minds.
course. So I think you partly answered this, but like, what's your general opinion on street racing? Like, why do you think people are so into it?
One of the big challenges about motorsports, if you're a fan of racing and if you ever wanted to get into it, everybody knows one of the big challenges is simply the cost. Even at an entry level, it's an expensive proposition. But then again, so is a set of golf clubs. It's all kind of relative.
Hmm.
But if you've got a road car, you feel like that is your ticket to be able to drive fast. And it's just not that simple. So for me, I my view on street racing is a very strong opinion because I know what the consequences are of something going wrong. You know, everybody kind of thinks, oh, it's never going to happen to me. Well, it's happens to me on a racetrack. If it can happen to me, it's pretty much happened to me.
Hmm.
And I know what the results of that are, what the consequences of that are. And again, that's in a controlled environment in a car designed to keep me safe with far more safety advancements and protections than a road passenger car has. And I know how risky that situation still is. So for me, there's just no reason to do it. If you have that sort of need for speed and you want to go race something, there are opportunities to get into something that are relatively inexpensive, that keep you much safer, keep the other people on the road much safer. And it's just really, there's just no reason for it.
Okay. Yeah. Just to kind of be more specific, I know you talked about like the whole safety difference, and obviously it's a lot more dangerous on the road. Like what sort of like specific safety equipment do you use that wouldn't be available to street racers? Like what's different with the Indy cars and what's more safe about that?
Right. So, you know, right off the bat, if you look at what just we're wearing as drivers, you're wearing a fire resistant suit. You're using a 6-point safety harness rather than a 3-point seatbelt. We obviously have a helmet on, which is going to, you know, protect the most important part of the body.
Mm-hmm.
We wear what's called a Hans device, which is a carbon fiber collar that sort of attaches to the helmet and is secured by the seat belts, which helps prevent neck injuries. And that's just the safety equipment that the driver's physically wearing. Then once we're actually in the car, you know, this car has been designed to take impact, to absorb that energy, disperse it away from the driver. You know, we don't have things floating around our dashboard that can come up and strike us in the head during an accident. You're much more contained in the car. You don't have as much room to move around and get sort of thrown around, even if you are wearing a seatbelt. And so, you know, there's much less mass to the car, which just means less energy in an accident. You know, inertia is not your friend when you're hitting something.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So, you know, there's an endless number of things that have been done to prevent all types of injuries to racing drivers. And while road cars have come a tremendously long way and they are much safer, you know, all of those safety measurements are for accidents. And if you're purposely driving fast and breaking the law, it's much less of an accident. And so what the cars are built for is not going grossly above the speed limit and getting yourself into trouble. They're built to keep you safe when you're staying within the confines of the road and the laws of the road.
Mm-hmm. Just to kind of add on to that, we at Teams Learn to Drive, we actually did like a little interview with these other people the other day, and they asked the question like why do car manufacturers, why do they make their cars so fast when the speed limits are like 100? I think nobody really knows that answer still. I want to know what your opinion is on that, because obviously a lot of these cars can go like 200-300 kilometers an hour when the speed limit's 100. Like I've always wondered why cars are like that. Do you have an opinion on that?
I mean, my theory is just marketing, right? I mean,
Okay.
they're in the sales business, and if you can market a car that goes X kilometers an hour or X kilometers an hour faster than the competitor,
Yeah.
it's human nature to want it, you know. And so for me, I think it's purely a marketing exercise.
Okay. So obviously there's a huge difference between the track and like on the road. So I know that you guys have like a whole like medical staff there. Like what are some of the other precautions that the track offers itself rather that the drivers wouldn't get on the road?
Right. So yeah, you've got the medical team is certainly one that can't be overlooked. You know, in the event of an accident, usually in less than 30 seconds, we have a team of at least 6 EMTs on the scene. They're trained either EMTs, firefighters. They're individually and specifically trained on extraction from an Indy car. There's a doctor in each car, and there are several of those cars positioned around the racetrack. So no matter where you run into a problem, you have help on the scene immediately. I think any doctor will tell you the biggest thing that is on your side to help save your life in a trauma situation is time.
Mhm.
The quicker that someone can get to you, the quicker you can get help, the exponentially higher your chances are of survival. So, on the road, you certainly don't have that. You have no idea how long it would take an ambulance or a fire truck or someone to get to you. The walls around the racetrack are very specifically designed. They look at the angle at which cars are heading into a certain corner, and they
Mhm.
design the barriers based on how a car is likely to hit those. What's the best angle to make the wall to reduce the impact? What are the best materials to make those walls to reduce the impact? And while there are, things on the road that have been designed to help in certain scenarios, when you're on a racetrack, you have one bit of road, everyone's going the same direction. It's much easier to predict, all the vehicles are the same. So it's much easier to predict where a car would end up, what type of accident you might have. On the road, everything's different. Speeds are different. Cars are different. You have cars, trucks, all sorts of different types of vehicles. And it's just, you don't have the scope to make sure that every little bit of wall or every bit of anything you could get into is covered or protected or angled a certain way to help you. And the one that always just stands out for me is overpasses, on a highway. They are just literally
Mhm.
immovable concrete blocks that if you hit it.
Oh, sorry, we
Oh,
lost you
sorry
for a
about that.
minute
Yeah, I
there.
think you froze for a
Sorry.
sec. So,
Yeah, no, I was just saying, so you don't have you don't have those kind of challenges on a racetrack. There are too
mhm.
many obstacles and too many things to take into account on a road, that there's just no way you could ever make it as safe as a racetrack.
Yeah. I think another problem with the street racing is a lot of these guys, they think that like they're not going to crash. They think they're amazing racers. Like they think they're amazing drivers. When in reality, these are amateurs that haven't driven a lot. Maybe they've driven for a few years. Can you talk a little bit about your experience? Like how long have you been racing for, and like how frequently do you train in terms of like hours per week? Like obviously I can imagine that you train a lot more than some of these street racers. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like any sport, your life is dedicated to your craft, right? And so our entire existence revolves around preparing ourselves for driving the race car, whether that's physical training, whether that's driver simulation, actually testing the car, engineering briefings. One of the things that's a little bit unknown about being a professional racing driver is the understanding that you have to have of your vehicle. We basically all have a minor degree in mechanical and aerodynamic engineering, because we have to understand what that car is
Mhm.
doing, how certain changes affect it, to make sure that we can get the most out of it. And we understand vehicle dynamics, how a car behaves in a certain situation. If you're an amateur driver, you're not going to have that understanding of what a car does, how it behaves, which allows you to sort of predict what it's going to do in certain scenarios. And if you don't know that, it's going to catch you off guard. You're more likely to get into trouble. If you're just driving, you're only a couple years into your having your license, you might not have been in any situations where you had to control a skid. You might not have been to a skid school, which is something I personally think should be part of the licensing course. I think every driver should have to go to a skid school and learn what that feels like, how to control it, how to react. A lot of times, the first time a young driver experiences a skid is seconds before their first accident, because they don't know how to react to it. So yeah, I mean, if this is just something you're jumping in your car on a Saturday night with your thing to do, but you have done no preparation. You do not know
Mhm.
what your car's capable of. You haven't properly spec'd out the stretch of road you're driving on. When we go to a racetrack, I will walk every foot of that track before I ever step into a race
Oh,
car and drive
wow.
around it, because I need to know every bit of road. I need to know where there are bumps, where there are creases, where there might be something that could throw me off. Because when you're racing, by definition, you're at the absolute limit, and all these small little things can make a huge difference. So street racing in that sense is the same. It's no different. And if you don't know what's coming up in front of you, you're putting yourself at just so much greater risk.
Mhm. Um, obviously these street racers, they seem to be very passionate about cars and racing and that whole sense. What advice would you give to them? What should they do? Should they take it to the track? What advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that there are people out there that are still passionate about cars. It's a dying thing, you know. Cars these days are getting so complicated. It's hard to work on them yourselves, and I think that's it's kind of hurting just general car culture a little bit. And so I would never sit here and discourage people from loving cars, from working on their cars, from being proud of their cars, and from wanting to drive their cars. But if you want to drive it like that, absolutely, there's a lot of opportunities and situations where you can sign up for track days. And I highly encourage everybody to go to a racing school. You know, we have one up in Oshawa that's just outside Oshawa in Bowmanville up at Mosport. That's where I learned how to drive a race car. And you can go and actually get some proper training, introduce you to the world a little bit, maybe show you some car clubs you can join that do track days up there that give you the opportunity to do that. If that's not your speed, if it's more just about the competition and wanting to say you are better than this guy or that guy, honestly, go-karting is the best way to do it. There are a lot of arrive and drive go-kart programs around Ontario that are relatively inexpensive. You know, you show up once a week at someone else's equipment. It's all even, so it is the driver. So if you want bragging rights and competition, that's one of the best ways to do that. You know, there are so many opportunities to whatever your desire is, whatever drew you to street racing or that world, whether it is the cars itself, the competition, whatever it is. There's an outlet that is legal, that is far safer, that is probably less expensive than you think, and it's just not worth doing it the way they're doing it.
So obviously you've experienced this whole journey of like kind of starting from the bottom and making it to the top in IndyCar. How do you think, like, what do these people need to do to get to that top level? What would your advice be? How do they get there?
Motorsports is such a tricky business to navigate. And I say business because it really is a business as much as it is a sport, just because of the cost of racing, you know, and understanding that element of it is very important, and the marketing side of going racing is very important. But ultimately, it's like anything else. If you are persistent and you work harder than anyone around you, you know, those opportunities will eventually present themselves. And it is not easy. This is not a profession you fall into. This is one you have to have a tremendous amount of passion for and be willing to put in a tremendous amount of work and sacrifice for. But if you are willing to do that and you have that inside you, then, you know, you have to, like anything else, you got to start at the bottom. You start in karts or entry-level cars and understand the off-track side of the sport as much as the on-track side of the sport. Understand the engineering side of the sport. All these things are going to be very important as you move your way up the ladder towards the top. And it ultimately just comes down to persistence, I think.
So obviously another bad thing about this whole the whole street racing thing is, upon research, we noticed that a lot of times there's drugs and alcohol involved at these events, and obviously that's going to end up causing more accidents, and it's obviously not very good for what's going on in the world. So what would be sort of your input on that when it comes to the whole situation for that?
I mean, there's a time and a place for certain things, you know, and drinking and driving is obviously never going to be one that meets up. There's a time to go drinking, there's a time to go driving, and they should never, ever intersect. And there's really not a whole lot else to say about it. You know, I mean, that's not hidden knowledge. That's not even really an opinion. That's just a fact. You know, there's not really two sides to that argument, you know, so it's tough to hear that that's kind of, you know, what that world's like, because it's those are just two things that should never mix.
Do you think that sort of like the taboo of street racing affects the public opinions of professional race car drivers? So like we interviewed some stunt drivers, and they said that they feel like street racers sort of like diminish their reputation. Do you sort of feel the same way?
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I can't say I've experienced a ton of that personally, where, you know, someone sort of looked at what I did for a living and thought, oh, you're encouraging these kids to street race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if anything, I would try to spin it the other way and say, no, we're showing them that there's actually a proper way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there's a proper avenue to go down and not be doing it on the roads. And again, I think part of what might make, you know, those people you interviewed, the stunt drivers, and maybe if there's other racing drivers that have had, you know, that sort of comment dropped on them, is the fact that anybody can just get in their car, rip down the highway and call themselves a street racer. It's really hard to do it professionally, you know, and it's really hard to be a professional stunt driver, sort of to like be associated with someone that's just some jerk who jumps in his car and try to say that they're somehow related is maybe a little bit insulting, because it took them a lot more work to get to where they are.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we touched a lot about like the whole street racing thing, but I actually just have some general questions I want to know. So like, what are some of the top speeds you hit while racing, like an IndyCar?
So I think the fastest I've ever seen my telemetry was about 241 miles an hour.
Wow.
So you're kind of just flirting around the 400K mark.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty quick.
And this is also just kind of a personal question, but I was curious, what kind of car do you drive on your own time, like at home?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get that one a lot, and I think the answer is actually somewhat appropriate for this conversation, because I drive an Acura MDX. You know, I drive an SUV, and I think people always kind of expect a racing driver to have some sort of hot sports car, but the fact of the matter is, driving on the road terrifies me compared to driving on the racetrack.
Oh, really?
That's not even. It's not even street racing. This is just driving down the road, because again, when I'm on the racetrack, right, I'm wearing far more safety gear. I'm in a car designed to keep me safe. I'm in a track designed to keep me safe, surrounded by medical personnel and EMTs. And I'm also on the road with a bunch of professionals that have dedicated their lives to that craft. And I can almost predict what they're going to do because they are professionals. On the road, I mean, anybody can jump in a car and be texting and driving, be drunk driving. Everybody is so unpredictable. The difference in skill, ability, comfort level, experience is massive. And like I said before, if something goes wrong, the consequences can be so much higher, because you don't have all that added protection that you would in a race car and on a racetrack. So I'm terrified on the road. I am constantly just paying as much attention as I can, because I know how quickly things can go wrong, and I know how much it hurts when something goes wrong. You know, that's one of the big things I think a lot of young drivers and even older drivers, if you've never been in an accident, you know, I sometimes do speaking engagements and this topic comes up, and in a room of, you know, 300, 400, 500 people, I'll say, okay, who's hit something going 50 kilometers an hour? Raise your hand, right? Who's hit something going 80 kilometers an hour? Okay, cool. Who's hit something going 150 kilometers an hour? Okay, cool. Who's hit something going 350 kilometers an hour? And all of a sudden, it's only my hand sitting up.
Oof.
Yeah.
You know, and so a part of the thing is, part of the thing is that these people on the road, they don't know what it feels like, you know, until you get bit. You don't realize the risk you're taking sometimes. So to answer, I know it's a long-winded answer, but I drive an MDX. I don't need a sports car on the road. The way I look at it, I've got a really cool, you know, hot car I get to drive on weekends, so I don't need anything fast on the road.
So that was pretty well it for most of the street racing questions. I just have one last question. We did a little research about you, and we noticed you were on Dancing with the Stars. So how was that whole experience? Can you talk a little bit about that? I want to know.
Yeah, an interesting experience, to be sure. Yeah, I mean, I got the call to see if I'd be willing to do it, and at first said no, but I got talked into it by a couple friends. Another IndyCar driver had actually done it a few years before, and he told me to do it, so I reluctantly signed up, and I got to tell you, it was a lot of work. It was an awful lot of work. It was 8 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 straight months. But as soon as I kind of looked at it as a competition in my brain and not necessarily how we were competing or what we were competing in, and just focused on the fact it was a competition, you know, the athlete in me really kicked in and put in a ton of work, a ton of hours. And I mean, from a guy who I think had maybe the most I could dance beforehand was this, you know, maybe the Macarena on a good day. We ended up finishing second to an Olympic gymnast. So, I mean,
Wow.
not terrible, all things considered.